So now we're importing something which allows us to get access to the database connection we set up initially when starting our server, which now is a concept that we can reuse. So in the save method of the product model, I can now get access to my database by calling getDB. Remember, getDB does simply return that database instance we connected to. So now we have a connection which allows us to interact with the database. And then here in MongoDB, you can call collection to tell MongoDB into which collection you want to insert something or with which collection you want to work. Because remember, in MongoDB, you have databases, collections, and documents. We have a database connection here, so the next level is a collection. So here we can connect to any collection, and just as with the database, if it doesn't exist yet, it will be created the first time you insert data. So here, I'll connect to a products collection. Now on that collection, we can execute a couple of MongoDB commands or operations. Now a full list can be found in the official docs, and of course you'll learn all about them and all the details in my full MongoDB course which I mentioned. In the official docs you can click on MongoDB server, and here for example click on MongoDB CRUD operations to learn how to insert, find, that is what query is, update and delete documents. And you'll see all the examples here and all the commands and how to configure them and so on. So this is a great place for you to dive deeper besides the other course I mentioned. But of course, here's a short introduction too. If you want to insert data, you can do this with insert one, or if it's multiple documents at once, insert many. Insert many then takes an array of JavaScript objects you want to insert. Insert one, which I'll do here because I want to insert one product, only takes the object you want to insert. Now, what do you mean with object? Well, you would simply pass an object where you have, like, for example, name, a book, price, $12.99, and so on. So this is something which would be valid code. That would insert such a document into the database. By the way, this is not JSON, this is a JavaScript object, but it will be converted by MongoDB. However, here in our case, essentially it's the product which we want to insert, right? So we could just say this and see how that works if we try to insert this into our database. Now this is all we need to do right now. Insert one then returns us a promise. So we have then and catch, and we can log any error we found, or we can have a look at the result we get back. So we can console log the result. With that out of the way, let me remove the Sequelize model and export our class with the save method. And now with that, we fixed the model file. Let's now go to the admin.js file. And here, obviously, we got a couple of methods or a couple of functions which still use parts of the model that won't work anymore, like this one here, request user create product for adding a new product. This will not work anymore. For now, we'll have to create a product without storing something about the user. We'll reintroduce this later again. So for now, we can override this here though, and I also want to comment out my other methods because these will not work anymore. So let's comment them out. We'll comment them back in later once it works. And therefore in the admin routes, here routes admin.js, there I also want to disable all routes that will not work anymore. So essentially that's all but this post route. So here for getting all products, this will not work anymore. And all these routes down there will also not work anymore. But these two routes should still work for add product. So now with that, I need to fix one more thing in the app.js file. Here, I need to import .MongoConnect here from my database utility file. And with that, now we're not only connected, but we should also be able to insert a new product already. So let's try this out. Visit localhost 3000/add product. And this won't load because in app.js, when I commented out the code here in app use, well, I should at least call next. Otherwise, every incoming request will die here. So with that changed, now if you reload, we are back on our admin add product page. Now let's simply check this and see if it works by adding a product. Now, I get an error here regarding create product, and that of course makes sense because in the admin.js file, I didn't change any code. So let's work on that code next, and let's make sure that we can add a product. So let's make add product work again. And for this, we'll not use the user anymore, but instead here, before we use then, we'll reuse that, so no need to delete it. Before we do that, we'll use our product model. So I'll create a new product constant by initializing product again. And here I will simply pass title, price, description, and the image URL. So we'll pass all that data into the constructor of the product. Then on this product, I can call save, and then here, to call then, I'll go into my model again, and I will return this here. So we'll return my collection and then this entire command chain, because that will allow me to treat this overall as a promise and chain then thereafter, and then therefore also redirect. So now with that, if I save that, and I go back to the form and resubmit that, I'm actually redirected to a page which is not found because I commented out all the shop pages. But if we go back to our server-side console, we see something interesting. We see that this here has to be the output of this console log line in the product model, where I print the result of the insert operation. And there we see a lot of data about that operation. And for us, important, if we scroll down to the bottom, we see one document was inserted. It received an ID, and such an ID is managed automatically by MongoDB because every document needs to have such a underscore ID. This is a must-have, and MongoDB creates it on the fly automatically if the object you enter does not have it. So we'll use that auto-generated ID. And then you see the data which we entered also was stored. So whilst we can't look into database yet because we're not fetching anything, we see that our insert one operation was successful and did successfully add a product into the collection, which is of course amazing. Now in the last lecture, we did insert a product into our MongoDB database, which is awesome. Now I also want to see it, and before we actually fetch it in our Node application, let me show you another tool called Compass. If you click on Get MongoDB on mongodb.com, you can choose that and you can download and install it for free as well. It's available for Windows, Mac OS, and Linux, and once you got that installed, you can start your Compass application on your machine. And this essentially is a tool that gives you a graphical user interface to connect to your database and to interact with it. So let's wait for it starting up here. And once it did start up, you can connect to it. Now to connect to it, let's go back to our MongoDB cluster and click connect here. And then click connect with MongoDB Atlas, choose your operating system, and then copy that URL down there. Now one cool thing is, if you now quickly close Compass again and you restart it after you copied that URL, it should tell you that it detected the connection string, and if you click yes, it will insert the most important pieces here for you. Now you still need to choose how you want to connect, to make sure your username is correct, and also enter the password for this user. You need to do this manually. All the defaults can be left as they are, and you should be able to now connect to your database. And here it is. And interesting enough, to be precise, you're now connected to the database server. And here you see a couple of databases, two default ones, which you don't need to touch and which you shouldn't touch, but then also your own one, shop. And the shop database here actually has a products collection, as you can see. And if we look into that products collection, in there, we can see the documents that are stored in there. And here is that one document we inserted. So there's one product we added in the last lecture. Now you can also insert documents and edit them inside of Compass. And check out the official Compass docs to learn all about the features you can use here. I just want to use this as a nice visual support so that we can see our data before we fetch it in our Node app. That being said, obviously the data is not that useful to us here. So let's go back to Node.js and write some code so that we can use the product data on our shop pages again, which we commented out at the moment. So let's work on our shop pages now, and let's make sure we can use our data there. For this, let me go to my product model again, and here, besides being able to save data, I of course also want to be able to get my products. So I'll add a static method again, and I'll name that fetch all. Now here I want to interact with my MongoDB database to fetch all products. For this, I will again return and then use DB collection to tell MongoDB to which collection to connect to. And here the collection I want to connect to is products, of course. And then there, MongoDB has a method for finding data, which is called find. Now find could be configured to also use a filter. For example, we could find all products that have a title of a book, and there are more elaborate filters than just equality filters available too. Again, something I cover in great detail in my MongoDB course if you want to learn more about that. Here, I of course want to find all products for now. So I want to find all products, which I can do by just calling find like this. Now the important thing about find is, find does not immediately return a promise though. Instead it returns a so-called cursor. A cursor is an object provided by MongoDB which allows us to go through our elements, our documents, step by step. Because theoretically, in a collection, find could of course return millions of documents, and you don't want to transfer them over the wire all at once. So instead, find gives you a handle which you can use to tell MongoDB, okay, give me the next document, okay, give me the next document, and so on. That being said, there is a toArray method you can execute to tell MongoDB to get all documents and turn them into a JavaScript array. But you should only use that if you know that we're talking about, let's say, a couple of dozens or maybe 100 documents. Otherwise, it's better to implement pagination, which is something we will implement at a later point of time in this course. So for now, let's use toArray, and then this returns a promise, and here we can again catch any errors we might be getting, but most importantly here, we should have our products. We can log our products here, and then also let's return our products in here. And let's see if that works the way we want. So now we have a fetch all method that hopefully works. One important thing is, I of course need to get access to my database by calling getDB in fetch all, just as I do it in save. And now let's head over to our shop controller. And there we have the getProducts function. Now this is the function I want to work on now. And instead of find all, let's now use fetch all, because that is how I named the method. And there I should get my products, and hopefully I get them in a format that works. Let's see. Let me also go to my shop routes now. And here, get index and get products, that should be fine. Let me comment out all other routes for the moment, because we can't work with them right now because, well, we have no code that would support them. By the way, in the shop controller, you also want to make sure that getIndex works by also using fetch all in there. So just as we did it in getProducts, we want to do the same in getIndex. Okay, so now I got some code in place. Let me go back to app.js finally and comment in that shop routes import. And not just comment it in, of course, but also uncomment this middleware down there. And now we hopefully have a setup where we can actually reload our root route, let's say, so just localhost 3000, and here we go. Here is our product, just like that. And of course it works automatically because I didn't change any property names. If you suddenly store the title in a field named name, you would have to adjust your view and so on. Well, and there is something where I want to adjust my view, and that is related to how we work with the IDs, but we'll see it in the next lecture. So we're able to fetch all the products. Let's now implement the code to fetch a single product. And for that, I'm back in the shop.js controller file. And here it's the getProduct function I want to work on. Here we get the product ID as part of the URL. And then we want to use our product model to somehow find the fitting product. And therefore, we of course need to work on the model again. And feel free to implement this on your own if you got some MongoDB knowledge. It's a great challenge then. Otherwise, of course, we'll just do this together. So, how would I fetch a single product? Well, besides having my static fetchAll method, I'll add another static method, findById. And you can name this however you want, of course. Here I expect to get a product ID as an argument, and then, just as before, I'll call getDB to get access to that database connection we have. And I then want to return the result of an operation where I use my collection, and there I will now pass products again because it's still the same collection I want to interact with. And I will find a product here, but I'll find only one product. And to do that, I'll narrow down the result set with find, and then I'll pass a JavaScript object to it, which allows me to configure a filter. And here, I want to look for a product where _ID is equal to prod ID, because that's the ID of the product I'm looking for. So with this, I'm returning theoretically all products which have this ID, but I know it'll only be one, so I can use find like this, and I'll only get back one product. Or do I? Well, actually, find will still give me a cursor, because MongoDB doesn't know that I will only get one. And here, we can use next, the next function, to get the next, and in this case here also the last document that was returned by find here. So here I can then add then and catch, and as always, log any error I might have, and then in then, where I will have my one product, there I will log it to the console for one, and then I will return my product. So now this should hopefully yield my product here. Now with that, if we go back to the shop controller with findById, I either have an error or I get my product and I try to render the product detail page. Now let's go to the routes and there to the shop.js file, and we need to comment in that route here for getting the product details. If we now save everything, let's click on details here. And one thing you can see is that this doesn't seem to work, right? We always get redirected to the /products page. So if I go back to the starting page, and we can tell the difference by the distance between the $sign and the character on the starting page. If I click details, I just get forwarded to products. Now why is that? Now this actually happens because no product ID is passed when I click details. And therefore we end up in this route. Now why is no product ID passed? If we have a look at our view, and there at our index.ejs file in the shop folder, in there we got our details button, and I do actually add the product ID here, but what is the error here? Well, I access product.id here, but with MongoDB it's _ID. So I should use product_ID. And the same, of course, on the product list page. There, I should also use product_ID. So in all the places of the app where we use product.id, we should now use product_ID. With that, if we reload that page here, the starting page or the products page, doesn't matter. If I now click details, now something else happens. Now we get stuck here because we have an error. But that is better than before, because now at least we do have an ID which we try to find. So what's the issue here now? Why do I get cannot read property title of null? Well, for one, it's worth noting that null is printed here as well. And that null should be stemming from my product model from find by ID when I console log the product. So it looks like we didn't find any product for that ID. And what could be the reason for that now? The reason for that is that the ID in MongoDB is actually stored a bit differently. And we can see this in Compass. The ID is actually such an object ID thing. Now, I did mention that MongoDB stores data in BSON format. And this binary format of JSON is not just used because it's a bit faster to work with, it is, but also because MongoDB can store some special types of data in there. An object ID is such a type. It's a type added by MongoDB. It's not a default JavaScript type. Actually, it doesn't exist in JavaScript at all. And it's simply an ID object which MongoDB uses because this generates and manages IDs which look random but actually aren't. So IDs, for example, are created in a way that if you create an ID now and an ID 1 second later, the ID 1 second later will alphabetically be a higher value than the previous one. But that's just one thing. So object ID is an object provided by MongoDB. And if we look for equality, we can't compare underscore ID, which in a database will only hold object ID values, with a string, because a string is not equal to the object ID. And the string in here does not count. MongoDB will not compare this. It compares the entire object ID. So to fix this, we simply go into our product model, and in there, I'll import MongoDB by requiring MongoDB from the package. And now I can use MongoDB to get access to that object ID type. So here, when I compare, I can use MongoDB.objectID. And I can create a new, this is a constructor, a new object ID to which I pass a string which will be wrapped by that. So now if I save that and I try reloading that page for that ID, now you see this works, because now I create such an object ID object, and therefore here, when I'm telling MongoDB, find me all documents where the ID stored in the database is equal to that, MongoDB will now succeed because we now pass an object ID object to the comparison instead of just a string. And now this works too. It's very important that you keep in mind that MongoDB stores IDs in underscore ID and that it uses this special object ID type for that. Let's complete the CRUD operations by ensuring that we can not just find all products and add them and find a single one, but that we can also edit and delete our products. And that is, of course, something which would happen in the admin area, and therefore we need to work on the admin side again. For that, first of all, make sure that our admin page here, where we list all products, works again. Feel free to pause the video here to try this on your own before we will implement it together. Were you successful? Well, let's do it together. First of all, in the admin routes, I want to comment in my get route here again, so that we are again able to get all products onto our admin overview page. Now here, we use admin controller get products to fetch and render all products. So if we go into the admin controller here, I of course need to re-add that get products function by simply commenting it in again. In there, I use request user get products, and this will not work anymore. So instead, let me here simply use my product model and then use fetch all. And this also returns a promise, so we can still use then on it, and we should still get all products, but now through our own modified model. So if I now reload this admin products page here, I see all the products, and now we can try editing and deleting them. Now for that, first of all, we need to go back to our views and adjust them to take account of the new ID format. So here in products EJS in the admin folder, in the views folder, in there, whenever we reference the product ID like we do here, it's products._ID. The same here, product._ID. That is really important. Now with that in place, if we reload that page, our edit and our delete button should work again and should make sure that we edit or delete the right product. So let's work on editing the product in the next lecture. Time to edit products. And for this, I'll first of all work on my admin.js file in the controllers folder. There we have two routes that are, or two functions that are related to editing products. The getEditProduct page, which is responsible for fetching the product that should be edited and for rendering it, and the postEditProduct page, which is responsible for saving these changes to the database. I'll comment both back in. And let's start with getEditProduct. There, the majority of the code can stay as it is, but when we then fetch the fitting product, we of course do this differently. We use product find by ID, and we find the product with prod ID, like this. And then we still get back products. However, well, actually we don't get back products anymore. We get back one product here, so no need to store it in a constant like this and extract it from an array. We get back one product automatically because we wrote that method in such a way. And we therefore can render this product. So this should work. Now let's quickly have a look at the view that belongs to this controller action, so to this edit product EJS file. And in there, you know what I'm looking for. We want to make sure we're always using product_ID when using the product ID, just to make sure that we extract the right thing from the document we get back from the server. So now with that, we got everything in place to hopefully make this edit button work partly. If I click on it, well, almost. Let's leave it on this page. The controller should work, but in the routes in the admin.js file, I of course have to comment this get route back in. So let's make sure this is done. And now with that, if we now reload that page, we indeed see the form with the default values filled back in. So now this is working, but of course, it's not that useful to only see the data, and we were able to fetch data before. The interesting part now would be to update it. Now to update it, let's go back to the product model. How could we update our product which is stored in the database? Well, let's go to the constructor and let's add a fifth argument here, the ID. And then I'll say this underscore ID is equal to the ID I'm getting here. You could name this underscore ID here too if you wanted to. So now we accept a kind of optional fifth argument. We're not passing it in the other places of the app, but here I do at least create the option of passing this too. And ID will therefore be undefined and be auto-generated by MongoDB, or we did set it, and then when we call save, I don't want to insert one, I want to create a new product instead. So for this, what I'll do is, I'll simply check if this underscore ID, if that is set, and if it is set, we'll update the product, otherwise we'll insert it. So I'll move my constdb function up there. I always need access to the database in both cases. And now I'll create a new variable, let dbop for db operation. And in the else case where we insert a document, dbop is equal to my connection to the database and then connecting to a collection and then inserting one. And then down there I can use dbop to follow along and actually return that. So now I have one case where dbop is simply my insert command and then I return my result. Or dbop is access to my database and to the products collection still. But then here I use update one. And as the name suggests, update one will update exactly one element. There are also update many, where you can update multiple elements at once, but here I know I only want to update one, so I can use update one. And now update one takes at least two arguments. And the first one is that we add a filter that defines which element or which document we want to update. So here again, I'll pass a JavaScript object, and we can filter for equality also, or run more complex queries, which you again can learn about in my MongoDB course if you want to. And here, I only want to find a document where underscore ID is equal to, and now again, I'll create a new MongoDB object ID to which I pass this underscore ID. So the ID which is part of that object here. So I'm looking for a document where the ID matches the ID I have here in my product I'm currently working with. And for that document, we now, as a second argument to update one, we now specify how to update that document. This again is a JavaScript object where we describe the update, and this is now not the new object. So we don't say this here, as you could imagine, that we tell MongoDB, find me the existing document and replace it with this. Update one does not replace. Instead, we have to describe the operation, and we do this by using a special property name, which is understood by MongoDB, kind of a reserved name, you could say, $set. This again takes an object as a value, and here we describe the changes we want to make to the existing document which we found with this filter. And here, you could now actually say this, and you would instruct MongoDB to simply set these key value fields, which you have in your object here, to the document it found in the database. And therefore, since these are only key value pairs which exist in the document in the database, it will update the values of the document in the database with your new values. You could also write this in a more verbose way and explicitly say title should be equal to this title and so on. But since we want to replace all fields, we can just say this here. And now with that, we have a database operation that will update an existing database object. By the way, the ID will not be overwritten or anything like that. Only the other fields are. So with that, let's go back to our admin.js controller. And in post added product, that is the part I want to work on in the next lecture to make sure that we actually are able to save our product. So we worked on the product model to make the save method more flexible. And now in the admin.js controller, in post added product, there we already have code where we find a product by ID, and this will work because find by ID is a method I created in my model. So here we have the product, or maybe we should name it product data, because here I will now create a new product constant by using my product constructor, so my own product class, and there I will pass my updated title, my updated price, my updated image URL, and my updated description, and my ID. Now actually, we don't even need find by ID then anymore. We can just get rid of that, and for now also of that, and simply create a new product with all the updated information. And we now also need to pass the product ID. There, you just need to make sure that you create a new MongoDB object ID object. So make sure that at the top of the file, you do actually require MongoDB. And now you can, of course, also create a new constant, name it object ID or whatever you want, and extract that object ID constructor out of MongoDB like this. And then you could just write new object ID and reference this basically. So we can now go down to post added product and pass a new object ID here with new object ID and wrap that prod ID you're extracting from the URL here and wrap that, or from the body of the request, and wrap that into object ID. Now we have that new product, and now we can simply call product save because we just modified the save method to support both creation and updating. So let me save all of that and let's give this a try. Let's reload that view here maybe, change the price to 19.99 and click update product. Now we get a page not found. Let's ignore that for now. And let's instead go back to MongoDB Compass and click that refresh icon here. Now that doesn't look like it worked though, right? The price is unchanged. But I also did not get an error. So what's wrong here? Well, you need to go to your admin.js routes again and uncomment this post edit product route. Otherwise, editing products will not be possible. So now if we load that product to edit again and we change that price, now this looks much better, or at least partly. If we have a look at MongoDB Compass, we see now it looks like I made a mistake with the assignment of values. So my description, and I can simply edit this here, my description now simply was the URL and the other way around. So let me change both and click update here. And now if we load this page again, it should work. But the most important thing is our method worked. Now what did I mess up? If I go to the admin controller, I'm assigning price, image URL, and description. Well, that is in the wrong order. It should first be the description and then the image URL. But that was only a little logical mistake I made. If I edit this again, back to $12.99, you see now this is working. And this also works. Let's see how it works if I added two fields at the same time. This also works. So this is how we can update a product with the help of MongoDB and with the help of Update 1. Now, one important note about the update video. What I did there is I actually passed an object ID in admin.js controller to my product constructor. Now, actually, I could also just pass product ID as a string and therefore remove my object ID creation up there and the MongoDB import. All of that is happening in the controller now. And if I do that and I try editing this and change the price to 16, you see now it fails. Now, if we go to the product model and we have a look at the save method, there I am actually looking for the right object. But I'll have a problem when updating it, because there I'll try to set my object ID to a different object ID, to a string, because here I'm just referring to this, which will hold the unmodified object ID. So what I should do is I should automatically convert the object ID, the ID here, which is a string, to an object ID object in the constructor, so that I can remove it down there, because underscore ID will now always be an object ID field, no matter if I'm using it in a filter or if I'm using it for updating. So now with that, if I edit this again and I change the price to 18, now this works again, because now I'm not trying an invalid update by trying to change the ID to some invalid value. So this is just an important note I wanted to add. You don't have to convert the ID in the controller file. You can leave that untouched, but you can do a general conversion in the product.js model file, which is the better approach of doing that. So now that we're able to add, fetch, and update products, let's work on deleting them. Now for deleting, you could implement different approaches. You could add a method to the product class so that you can create a new product object and call delete on it just as you call save on it. But I will go with a static method. And I'll add a static method which I'll name delete by ID and where I expect a product ID as an argument. Now in here, of course, again, we need access to the database. So let's call getDB to get access to that one central database connection we configured at the start. And then on the DB, again, it's time to reach out to the products collection. And on that collection, we want to delete an element. Now, as always, you find more in the official docs and the CRUD operations. If we click on delete documents, you see that just as we had insert one, insert many, and so on, we also have delete many and delete one. Now, I don't want to delete many products, but exactly one. So I'll delete one product here. And you need to specify a filter now. So again, pass an object where you describe how to find that product. And again, it will be our boring ID equal to check here. Now here, product ID is an argument, so we need to convert it to an object ID manually again by passing it to the object ID constructor. And now MongoDB will go ahead and delete the first element it finds that has this criteria fulfilled. So I will return here, and of course, just as before, we can add then and catch here if we want. We can catch any error and console log it. And we can also work with the result of this operation. We could console log it. I'll just console log, delete it, and that will be it. So now we have the delete by ID method. Now we just need to add it. So in the admin.js controller file, here, the post delete product route, let's comment it back in, or not route, the action I mean, of course. We extract the product ID, and then here we had a different flow. I first of all found the product here. Now we don't do that anymore. We just call product delete by ID instead. We pass the product ID as a string, and then we just have our then block here, which won't receive an argument. And yeah, that is it. We redirect thereafter. So let's go back to our application. Let's quickly add a new dummy product with totally invalid and uninteresting data. And that fails. That is an interesting behavior. Let's fix that in a second. Let's first of all check if deleting works. I get redirected to a page that is not found. Yeah. Makes sense, because obviously working in a controller is not enough. I need to go to my admin routes and comment in the post delete product route. So after changing this, let's now click delete. And now I got no products here. Let's confirm in Compass by quickly refreshing that page, and our product is gone. So deleting works. Let's now see what's going wrong when I tried to add that product. Deleting works, but when I try to add a product, and I'll just enter some dummy data here, that fails. And it seems to fail because I would imagine that in save here, we somehow make it into this if block. So that underscore ID is the problem. And that makes sense because I actually do initialize underscore ID here at the beginning by creating a new MongoDB object ID. So even if we pass no ID, and this therefore is undefined, this will create an object and store it in underscore ID. So underscore ID down there will always be defined. And if it's just such an empty or automatically generated object ID object, this should be the issue here. So how can I overcome this? Well, for example, with a ternary expression, we can check if ID exists basically. So if this returns true in an if statement. And if it's the case, then I want to create my object ID object. Otherwise, I'll store null. And null will be treated as false down there. So with this tiny change in place, with this ternary expression added in the product model, we should be able to add a product real quick with some dummy values. And now it's created. So now this is working, and it was just the fact that we were always creating such an object ID object, which we shouldn't. We got the basic CRUD operations with MongoDB covered. How you can insert, find, update, and delete elements with MongoDB. And you also learned how to connect to MongoDB. Now, let me show you how you can now work with relations. And for that, let's work with some users again. Now, with Sequelize, we didn't have an authentication flow, and we will not have one here either. But now I want to create new users at the beginning here. And for that, I'll first of all work on my user model, of course. I'll keep it really simple, but of course, I'll again a normal JavaScript class again. So let me create a new class, user, and add a constructor. And in that constructor, I'll get a username and an email, let's say. And then I'll just store this in a name property and in an email property. And you could add more. You could work with this however you want. I'll then add a save method to be able to save that user to the database. And of course, I'll also add a static method for finding a user by ID. And here we'll get the user ID as an argument. Now, here's your challenge. Try this on your own. Pause the video here and try implementing this on your own. Try using MongoDB and that central MongoDB connection we have to save a user with the help of the save method and to find it by ID. Good luck. After a short break, which gives you the chance to pause the video, we'll solve this together. Were you successful? Well, let's start by first of all importing our Mongo database client. So I'll name this DB again, and I'll import it by requiring our database file in the util folder, and there I'll access getDB, and I'll name this getDB up here too. Now let's start with the save method. And there I'll create a new constant, db, and I'll call getDB to store my database client in that constant. Now on that client, on this constant here, we can reach out to a collection, and obviously this will now not be the products collection, but we could name it users collection if we wanted to. Now, in this collection, I want to insert one new element here, and that new element will be this. So this JavaScript object we're in. So an object with a name and an email property. This is what I want to store as a user for now. Now with that, we can again use the then and catch if we want to, or we just return that and let whoever calls this listen to that if there is a need for that. Now we can also work on find by ID already, and there I again will get access to my database client, and then I will return db collection users, and here I now want to use find again to find a specific user. We can narrow the user down by comparing the underscore ID, and now the important thing here is of course that you need to convert user ID, which I expect to be a string here, to an object ID. So let me import MongoDB by requiring MongoDB like this. And now here I'll follow a slightly different approach, which I also already showed before. And I'll create an object ID constant and simply store access to it by accessing it up here. But I'm not calling it, I'm not creating an object ID here. I'm just storing the reference to the object ID class in my object ID constant. And then down there, I can just write new object ID thanks to my constant up there and pass user ID to it. And this should find me all fitting users, and I therefore get back a cursor, and now I can call next to get the first, and as we know, only element that matters to us. So now I'm returning this here. As a side note, you could also use find one if you're sure that you only find one element, and this will now not give you a cursor, but immediately return that one element. So then this would be an alternative. And I will use that here, but of course this is something I haven't shown you before. So if you used find and next, that's perfectly fine. So here I'll use find one, and now I got two methods in place that should allow me to create new users and to then find that user. Now with that user model added, let me go back to the app.js file, and in there I will import my model. So here I'll import user by requiring user from /models/user, like that. With user imported, first of all, we had some code here, which I want to comment back in, where I want to find a user with this ID here, and then store it in the request. So I will still use that here. However, I'll change the ID in a second. First of all, when connecting, I also want to add some code to see if a user with a certain ID exists. And for that, I will actually create that user here in Compass. So I'll connect to the shop database, and I'll create a new collection here, users. And of course, this collection name here should be the collection name you chose in your code. I'll create a new collection, and then go into that collection. And now, if you have a look at your user model, here I'm storing a name and an email for a new user. So if we want to create one behind the scenes in Compass, we can insert a new document here, and here is the automatically generated ID, and I can enter a name, and you can use any name you want here, and of course an email, and insert that document. And now it's this ID, this part here between the quotation marks that matters to me. I'll take that and I'll use that in app.js. So here I could now create that user if it didn't exist, but of course I now know it exists because I created it behind the scenes. Later we'll add a real authentication flow where users can sign up by themselves, don't worry. But here in my middleware, where I find a user by ID, I can now search for that ID and I convert that in the user model. Remember, that is why I can use a string here. Okay, so now I have that in place again. I get access to my user, and now we're at least prepared to set up a connection between our product and our user, which we can use later. So let me save that. That should work. And in the next lecture, let's use that user object and store a reference to that user in our database. Okay, so time to use our user object. And the question, of course, is where do I want to use my user object? Well, I want to use that user object when creating a new product, right? When saving a product, I want to store a reference to a user here, or embed the entire user data, as you learned. However, for products and users, you could actually find arguments for both approaches here. You certainly don't want to enclose all the user data in an embedded document, because that would mean that if the user data changes, you need to change that data in all products. But if you do include something which is unlikely to change very often, like the username, for example, well, then you could certainly go ahead and embed that together with the ID so that you always have that ID to fetch more data about the user if you need to. You got a find by ID method in the user model after all. Or that you have at least some snapshot data, like the username, available immediately. If that should change, you need to update it everywhere. The alternative to this is that you just store the ID, so just a reference, and therefore if you need connected data, you always have to fetch it manually from two collections, but on the other hand, you might not do that too often. And therefore here, indeed, when I fetch the products, I don't really need the user data. We're not displaying the user name anywhere in our app, so I actually just want to store the user ID so that we know who is connected, even though we're not fetching that a lot. Now, what does this mean for our application here, though? Well, it means that when creating a new product, we can pass the user ID, we can accept the user ID here. So this user ID is equal to user ID. We store this as a property of our product now. And with that, we have all we need in the product model. Now we need to make sure that we do pass that user data when creating a product. So in the admin.js controller, when adding new products, here I want to pass null for the product ID because we don't have that when creating a new product. But for the user ID, I want to pass the ID of the user, which, as you know, we now store in our request. We do this in the app.js file, right? We have that middleware, which we set up in an earlier module, where we find that user and where I then store that user in our request. Now, this is a bit of a constructed example because I'm storing it just to extract the ID, which I hard-coded here. So we could just hard-code it into our code anyways. But the idea here, of course, is to show you how you can extract the user in one central place and then reuse it in any other route. And that is the idea here. Later, once we added authentication, we'll manage that user a bit differently. So for now, we just have that user object in the request, and therefore in the admin.js controller, here I can access request user and then underscore ID, which will be just a string here, because when retrieving data, the object ID is converted to a string for us. So we have just the string here. Now with that, we should actually store the user ID when creating a new product. Let me first of all delete that old product, and then let's quickly add a new product here. And I get an error that I can't read property ID of undefined, and this should be coming from inside our admin.js file here when I try to access my user underscore ID. So something seems to be going wrong here. I'm storing the request user here though. Let's go to the user model, find by ID. Let's add then and catch here. And catch any error we might be getting when fetching that user. And here I'll also console log the user object I'm getting right before I return it again. And with that, let me try to reload the admin product, add product page. And I now get an error. We did retrieve the user here. But then I sent duplicate headers by the look of it. Yeah, because I'm calling next too often here in app.js. Since I added the other code again, I don't need to call next at the bottom of it. So let's save that to not call next too often. Let's now reload this page here. And now I just fetch the user with the ID, which is a string here. So that is actually valid. Now let me try adding this again. And now this works. So it was that error with the double next. So now if we have a look at our products here, we see that products now also have a user ID, which is just a reference pointing at the user who did create that product, which is one way of establishing relations, the way you already know from MySQL, of course. This is not an embedded document, but here the argument simply is when we're fetching products, we don't really need any user information, hence we do it just like that. This, of course, will change once we start storing orders. There you could say it does make sense to store information about the user, for example, the email at least. And for the product, you want to store the title and the price maybe. So there it makes sense to suddenly aggregate this together. Speaking of that, why don't we work on cart items and orders next? So we worked on products and users. It's now time to work on the cart and the cart items again. And that will now change now that we're using MongoDB. So let me start with the cart model. Now, what is the overall goal we have here? Well, obviously, for every user we have, we want to store a cart, right? And that user will have a cart, and that cart will then hold the products. So actually, with MongoDB, this is a great place for embedded documents because we have a strict one-to-one relation between a user and a cart, and therefore, there's no need to manage this with a reference. I can actually get rid of my cart items and my cart model so that I just have product and user and for now also the orders. And now on the user model, there I also want to store my cart items. Now the question is how? The answer is, we got our shop.js controller, and in there, we got code to store something in a cart. Here for the user, we got the cart, and then we got the products to see what's in there, update it, and then save it back. Now we can do that with the help of the user model. Let's say on a user object, instead of just having save, I also add a new method, add to cart, something like this. Now here, add to cart would be a product I want to add to the cart, of course. Essentially, what we're doing here in shop.js already. Here, we already fetch, or we got everything we need to fetch a product, which we could then add to the cart. So I expect to get a product here, which I can add. And then in add to cart, I can have all the logic I need to find out if that product is already inside of the cart, and therefore if I just want to increase the quantity, or if it is not, and therefore I want to add it for the first time. Now to understand how this works, you must not forget that add to cart will be called on a user object, and will create that object with data we fetched from the database with the help of find by ID. Here we will return a user. So therefore, we just need to be able to accept more data in a constructor, for example, the cart, so that we can also store the cart in our JavaScript object here, which will be based on the data stored in the database. So now we can assume that we'll have a cart property on our user, and now we just need to find out if that cart contains a certain product already. Now, the cart will essentially be an object, let's say, that looks something like this, an object with some items. So an object which has the items array in there. So what we could do if we assume that this is the case, we could create a new constant, cart product, and then use this cart items and find, let's say, the index of a product in that cart with the same ID as the product we're trying to add again. So I'll pass a function to find index, which simply is a function JavaScript will execute for every element in the items array. And then here I want to return true if I found the right product in my items array. And this will be the case if CP, which is the product in the items array, if the underscore ID there matches the underscore ID of the product I'm trying to insert. If that is the case, so if this returns a valid index, so something else than -1, which would be the default otherwise, then I know this product already exists in a cart. And then I just need to find out what its quantity is. Now we'll do this in a second step. First of all, we can assume that there will be no products in the cart because we're just starting from scratch. So let's add the code to add a product without checking whether that product exists yet. So we can comment this out for now. And instead create a constant, maybe named updated cart, which is an object where we might have an items property, which is an array where I will now include my product. However, not just the product as I'm getting here, I also want to add a quantity field. So I'll actually say product quantity, and this is how you can add a field on the fly in JavaScript, equals 1. Now, another approach, maybe a bit more elegant than that, is that in items, you create an object with curly braces, because we'll add an object here, and then you use the JavaScript spread operator, 3 dots, to pull out all properties of this object, so of the product object, and then with a comma you can add or overwrite a property. So here I'll add the quantity property and set it to 1. Whatever approach you choose, this will create an object which holds an items property, which is an array of, in our case, only one object, one product with an additional quantity information. And now I want to update the user to store that cart in there. So I will get access to my database with getDB, and I'll reach out to my users collection, and I'll update one user in there, and I'll update the user with this user ID here. So what I need to do is I need to accept that ID as an argument. So this underscore ID will be equal to ID, let's say. And then here I can say I want to find a user where underscore ID is equal to new, and now I'll use object ID, which I extracted up here, because I need that for the comparison, where this is equal to this underscore ID. And once I found that, I'll describe how to update. Now I'll use $set, where I pass an object which holds all the information about which field to update in which way. And here, I essentially want to keep everything as it is. I don't want to change the username or anything like that. I'll just set cart equal to updated cart. That is it. So cart, which I expect to have in a user in the database, will now receive updated cart. So this object as a new value, which will overwrite the old one. And this is important. It will not merge this with the old one. It will not merge the elements in the items array. It will simply overwrite the old cart with the new cart. Now I can return this here, this update1 call. And what this should do is, well, it should update our user to add a product to the cart. For now, it will always overwrite any existing products in the cart. We'll fix this later, but for now, this should work. Now let's wire it up in the next lecture.